All right, let's make a start. I'll just narrow this down so we're not going to get too much over the top of our screen. And welcome everyone to the week 3 Zoom session. So this week we've got, the pace is obviously picking up in the course, and it's picking up probably across all of your courses. And this week we're talking about learning and teaching scientifically. Now, we're trying to build on a whole repertoire of things that we're looking at as the course goes on. Now, clearly the 5 E's model is at the centre of the student's journey. And we've also got this notion of effective questioning and doing science investigations, which is something that we're also trying to trap into and talk about as much as we possibly can in this unit of studies. I'll just try and bring up some thumbnails so I can find out who's with me here today and shoot through some questions. So we can see there a couple of little vignettes there. These are from the Science by Doing. Now, I do encourage, if you haven't enrolled in Science by Doing, to enroll in it and have a really good look at it. Now, I know most of you are thinking, but wait a minute, it's a high school process. Actually, it's the high school extension of Primary Connections. It's the same people, it's the same curriculum. And the reality is, as a primary teacher in Queensland, you could find yourself teaching up to and including Year 9 science. So it doesn't hurt to have a really good look at how science is operating across the years. And in fact, our second assignment, our digital cards, asks us to do a junior or middle primary unit and an upper primary unit too. So we get to actually experiment with our pedagogies at each end of the curriculum. So we've got a couple of students in each of these vignettes sort of hypothesising, trying to turn inquiries and queries into scientific processes. And that's what we're talking about this week, learning and teaching scientifically. Now, from the Q&A this week, I'll just follow my usual format. It's really important, if you can please, if you are having trouble with the course, give me a call, have a chat. The final date that you can change your enrolment, you can withdraw from any of your courses, is March 27th. So you can do that without penalty. That's financial or academic penalty. So if you're looking at having to change your enrolment, think carefully about those issues now. Pick up the phone and call someone. Talk to them about your options, okay? Because, you know, there's nothing like a third set of eyes. They may see something you can't see. And so hopefully that may actually help you with your decision making too. So please, if you are thinking about that, March 27th, don't penalise yourself. Whatever you do, there is no need to penalise yourself. A couple of thank yous this week. Kate McNamara, great questions on the PK forum. It's just brilliant to see Kate in there interrogating those, working out exactly what she's going to do and how she's going to do it. Sarah had a thing about butterflies, and hopefully she'll be able to enjoy that and explore it still. The interesting thing about the 5 E's is when you look at the primary connections, it follows a continuum, and we'll talk a little bit about it today. Stages 1, 2 and 3, it's pretty much sharing same content with students, but by the time they get to stages 4 and 5, the 4th and 5th E's, they're starting to really branch out and look at real world applications. So butterflies would easily slot in there. David Graham got by a little bit with the help from his friends. Well done, David. He's posting some questions and got some great answers. And Kaya pointed out the Akara downtime. Now, I actually got on there today. The page was still down for week 4. So what I've done is actually changed links and made them directly to the Primary Connection site itself. Sorry, to the Australian Curriculum site itself. So I've changed the links, and last time I looked about an hour ago, they were still functioning quite well. All in all, it's one pretty quiet forum. And, you know, I do encourage you, please, to get in there if you've got questions and ask your questions. Does anybody have a question they'd like to explore from the forum before we go on? Anyone in particular that got anything they'd like to raise? We've covered most things there, the broken links, Kate with the 5E learning cycle. If you haven't tuned into Kate's post, get in there and have a look. There's probably something that quite relates to you. Paisha ideas, Fiona. Sarah and the butterflies. Melinda's talking about her unit of study. Kate again with engagements, and Carly with an older question about animations. There is also a forum in the Paisha link as well, and it's not used as much, but you may also find some good questions in there. But please, it's a quiet forum, but if you've got any questions, you know, please think about asking them, because chances are there are hundreds of other people thinking the same thing. Well, not hundreds, there's only 180 in the course, but there'll be several others thinking the same thing. So this week in the subject, we draw on quite a few big guns. We're talking here about thinking and learning scientifically. And Cat Stevens, I mean, I remember when I was a young person, they had a little escort panel van, and all the time we had Cat Stevens blaring from that panel van. And one of my favourite songs, of course, was Where Did the Children Play? And I've put that on the course this week for you because, I mean, we're talking there in the 70s. I mean, Cat Stevens was 18, 19 when he had tuberculosis. That's when he wrote most of his songs. And he was bedridden for 18 months. And he wrote all of these wonderful songs. And then, of course, he went on and converted to Islam, and of course recently toured Australia. For anyone who saw him, he's still as good as ever. But the same old age, lamental tunes. Where will the children play? We're reaching the sky, we're scratching the sky. We're building higher and higher. We're using up all the green. The sorts of questions that kids really want to ask. Yahoo Serious, I threw him in there too because let's face it, it was quite a popular show. He invented surfing. He also invented rock and roll music, and he tells his dad at one stage early in the movie, "I want to be a physicist." And his dad, of course, being a true Tasmanian, says, "What do they grow, son?" We've got Monty Python in there, and if you haven't had a look at the She's a Witch sketch, it's one of my favourites. Do have a look because it's a brilliant application of scientific reasoning and how scientific reasoning still can lead to misconceptions. Science by Doing appear with the 5 E's vignettes. They're all there for you to watch. We also talk about Lego and the 4 C's because we don't want you to think that there's only one inquiry model, the 5E. It's not. There are many. And particularly in STEM, Lego and the 4 C's are actually much more popular than the 5 E's. In New Zealand, for instance, the POE is much more popular than 5 E's. Problem-based learning is a big thing in the UK. Bruce Pascoe pops up again this week. We had him earlier in the course when he talked about the old people and some of the beliefs, scientific models of Indigenous Australia. And in this week, he deconstructs misconceptions around the fact that, they were hunter-gatherers, the Indigenous folk, and talks in some depth about some of their agricultural sciences. The team from Masiti pop in with the Indigenous Constructors module, and this may be really, really useful for some of you targeting topic number 4, I think it is, in the first task. And of course, one of your tasks for the week is to have a go at putting together an Indigenous resource, an Indigenous science story with the Australian curriculum and explaining its relevance. And the one I've put there for you is one of my favourites. It's Damari and the Crocodile. And of course, he's one of the Spirit Brothers, and it all talks about the wonderful relationship he had with Ganyara, the crocodile, and the way they teased and played together. And ultimately, in the end, well, I won't spoil the end, but you'll see the creation myth emerges from that. So the whole purpose of drawing all of this together in the ebook this week was to suggest that inquiry learning is alive and well. It takes many forms. It looks like many different things. So when you put together your Paishakusha, don't be limited, okay? If you think that you can go and push a boundary and explore something, do it, because inquiry learning, as you can see from the cast here, Yahoo Serious, the young guy with the Einstein hair, it takes many forms. Monty Python, anything really fits into this rubric we call inquiry learning. It is no one thing. I'd like to start this week by talking about some of the concepts behind science. And we talk about mythos and cosmos. Now, mythos, of course, is mythology, and we know that the Greeks had a rich mythology. Mythology goes back to Celtic times. And believe it or not, Celtic and Indigenous cultures are very, very similar. Even modern-day Celtic cultures and Indigenous cultures have many, many shared values. When we look at mythology, is I guess the spiritual side. Cosmology is the science side. And there's been a split. Okay, it's led to a demarcation in the fields of science as society has developed. Now, science as we know it is only about 120 years old. The word science only was used for the first time just over 100 years ago. So it's a relatively new concept. Up until then, it was known as arts. So science, medicine, healing, alchemy, all of these wonderful practices were all arts. And the cosmology, as our understanding of our world, our cosmology changes and grows, of course our mythology needs to grow. But it hasn't, for a whole range of reasons. And one of the main reasons, when we go back to looking at what historians and analysts say, is that, and Joseph Campbell is one of these famous people, you may know him as the father of myth, but he argues that a mature cosmology, a mature science, needs a mature mythology, a mature spiritual side. And the argument here, of course, is leaning towards Indigenous cultures and alternate interpretations of science. And it all goes back to Genesis, around about the time of Genesis, about the year 300. The Judean-Christian myth kind of froze around about that time. And what happened, of course, with the freezing of the world as it is, look, it was made in 7 days. That's what happened. We don't know what happened on the 8th day. Don't ask me. It was made in 7 days. And that's the kind of story we're telling here. It kind of frozen around about the year 200, 300 BC, and there's been no real scope for expansion since. And we're only starting to see, really, in the last 150 to 200 years, I guess, the authority of the church being challenged. And some modern examples of this, for instance, are in birth control, particularly in the South Americas, food sustainability right across the planet, water shortages, HIV, climate change. We're starting to see science making huge inroads into what was a cosmology driven by a limited view of the world. So we're starting to see, science, neuroscience, neurophysicism, quantum mechanics. We're starting to see all of these amazing frontiers open. And we're seeing this gap between the study of the natural world and the study of the human or social world. And we're seeing science now starting to colonize both. The natural world, absolutely. The human world, psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics. We're starting to see an inroad of science into very traditional ways of thinking, so much so that we now talk about the science of politics as well. So this notion of mythos and cosmos, what is catching up with what? And again, we picked this up in week 8 and 9 and also week 10. We look at again how science is challenging mainstream thoughts. And this week, of course, that becomes apparent. Oh, sorry, I've gone backwards. That becomes apparent when we start to look at people like Galileo. When he challenges at his time in the 15th, 16th century, he challenged the Pope and held that up to him. So we can look at every assumption. And what we're saying here with inquiry teaching is there's no such thing as a presuppositionless observation. Now, this goes all the way back to Francis Bacon. And not only is bacon one of your favourite foods, but it is also one of your favourite philosophers and ultimately one of your favourite scientists. With Francis Bacon, there is another Francis Bacon who was an artist, for those of you in the art field, but he came up with this notion of presuppositionless observation. In other words, no observation comes to you empty-handed. Now, a couple of examples here. I've got this, the word fly down here. We can see it in its context. And, of course, the content, the little arrow, the mark, there's a few other, shapes, meaningless shapes. But when we put them together, we actually have a very rich context. And this is what we mean by scientific thinking, scientific inquiry. How can we take relationships? How can we take things that are unclear, that are seemingly disconnected? And how can we put them together into some sort of relational framework that increases our knowledge and also helps us explore and explain? And we've got this little shape here. Now, is it a hexagon? Is it a cube? You tell me. I mean, it all depends what you bring to it. So it could well be a presuppositionless shape. But what we're actually looking at is you will see it as you choose to see it. And we can look at a few other examples of that. We've got the old lady here. And, oh, good, I am recording. We've got the old lady here, or have we got the young lady? Can anyone see both? Rosalind, can you see the old lady and the young lady in that left-hand picture? Okay, what we've got here is the chin, pursed lips, the pointed nose. We've got the old lady. Or is this the chin turning away of a fine young dame? Again, it all brings on the suppositions we bring to the picture. Over here on the right-hand side, umbrellology. I was talking about the rain in Cairns today. Okay, really interesting point. Now, is umbrellology a science? Is it something that I discovered today? Because when I looked at all of the umbrellas, I discovered some trends. Most of the black umbrellas, 65% of umbrellas were black. They were owned by men. 15% were red. They were owned by young people. Am I on the verge of a science here? Can I make some observations? Can I produce some trends? Can I create some data? Can I actually come up with a science of umbrellology? Okay, or can I not say it? And all of these are the things that are shaping our thinking for this week. What is scientific thinking? Is it something, is it pseudoscience or is it real science? And Bertrand Russell, if anyone's heard of Bertrand Russell, famous mathematician, he came up with inductivist logic. and he told the story of his pet turkey. His pet turkey was a bit of a mathematician, and you know, for a whole year he sort of monitored what times he was being fed, and he was fed at 9 o'clock every morning. And then there was the dry season, he was fed at 9 o'clock. The wet season, he was fed at 9 o'clock. The windy days, he was fed at 9 o'clock. Okay, after 364 days, he deduced that he was going to be fed at 9 o'clock the next day. Unfortunately, 9 o'clock the next day was Christmas Day, and he had his head cut off. So we can't trust inductivist logic. And this is Bertrand Russell's message to us in that rather sophisticated tale of the turkey. Karl Popper talks about falsification. And, you know, a theory, the whole purpose of scientific thinking is to falsify itself. You know, so a theory is a theory until it's proven, but it can't be proven because every time you fail to falsify it, you've got to start again. And one of the prime examples here is Darwin. And we talk about Darwin a little bit in this course. An amazing story about Charles Darwin as a child. I mean, his love of science was just phenomenal. He was an avid bug collector. And as the story goes, he was out about 3 miles away from his home one day, and he found 2 bugs that he'd never had in his collection before. And then all of a sudden he saw a third one. But he realised that he'd run out of hands. He had nowhere else to put the bug. So he took one of the hands in his right hand, put it in his mouth, caught the other bug with his right hand, and ran 3 miles home with a bug in his mouth and one in each hand so he could pin them to his bug board. This is Darwin. Now, Darwin's theory of evolution, believe it or not, he sat on it for many, many years. It was, you know, one of the most significant paradigm changes that we know of. And like Galileo, it challenged the church incredibly. Now, Mrs. Darwin was a devout Christian, and one of Mr. Darwin's, Charles Darwin's, biggest concerns was about upsetting his wife with his theory of evolution, would you believe? So he sat on it for a very long time. And another reason was that Lord Kelvin, the most dominant scientist prior to Charles Darwin, actually had dated the age of the Earth at no more than 1 million years old. And for Darwin's theory to be proven, of course, it had to be hundreds of millions of years old. The Earth had to go through extensive evolution. So part of scientific thinking is this falsification process. Darwin had to falsify Kelvin's theories in order to get his own theory off the ground. So here we're talking about the complexity of scientific thinking. Now, we could go into this, you know, no end. People have written books on this. People have written encyclopedias on it. Our challenge really as teachers is to understand that we've got to give our kids a reliable framework for investigating, for learning science that we can then teach into, that we can then disrupt, and, you know, in that constructivist sort of mode. And just to highlight that point, a couple of new things that scientists discovered just in the last 12 months, that we've got a new organ in our digestive system that they never knew of before. They've now realised they've been wrong all along. And of course, we're talking about Earth-sized planets and alien life. So we're talking about, you know, a whole range of new discoveries in science all the time, including new species and a whole range of things. So science continues to falsify itself. So in this world of complexity and this world of dynamic and continuous change, how do we teach kids to enjoy science? How do we teach them scientific rigour? And is this one of the reasons why we're seeing kids pulling away from science in huge numbers? Because scientific knowledge and knowledge in general is not frozen. That the mythos and the cosmos need to develop hand in hand. So when we look at the Moodle for this week, teaching and learning scientifically is really at the core of what we're doing with our Australian curriculum. So it's critical. And the topic this week explores the investigative approaches that we can use in the classroom in addition to fair tests, as well as the importance of language. So language and literacy are critical to developing mental models. And here we go to, you know, a couple of well-known, Boyd, for instance, talked about back loop learning processes. And here we've got the real world. It gives information feedback to the learner who makes a decision about what they see on the left-hand side here of the diagram. And it can also be double loop learning. The real world gives information feedback, the decision. However, we may have previous beliefs, we may have a culture, we may have had experiences that are going to help us form a model of what this means, and that's going to feed into our decision-making process. And of course, we'll make a decision. That decision will be supported, or it'll be turn out like Bertrand Russell's turkey to be completely wrong, and that's going to change our mental model. This is what we call single loop and double loop learning. As you can see, we go through the loop here initially of learning, we add the single loop that stems into our own culture and background, our own mental model. And we can also add what Jarvis called a double loop, the real world information feedback, the decision. The mental model then interacts with the information feedback, okay, and the decision-making rules can either change or they stay the same. Where we can go on. Jarvis, 7 years after talking about double loop learning, then introduced the notion of triple loop learning. So it gets more complex. But what we're saying here is that inquiry learning is a dynamic process. Okay, it's an interaction between real world information feedback and decisions. And sometimes we can do that in relation to one mental model or one mental process. Sometimes that mental process, depending on the level and type of our teaching, can be a continuous loop. Students can be learning constantly through 5 E's or through POEs or through problem-based learning. They can be learning to move around that mental model as much as they possibly can, creating and recreating, and with the teacher reconstructing new decision-making rules. And this is why we're talking, intently. This is why the Australian curriculum focuses so much on inquiry learning. So a couple of notes there for you. I actually put the PowerPoint slide up on the Moodle today so people could get it beforehand and follow along tonight. But mental models affect the way people work with information and also affects our final decision about what that information means. If a decision changes, the mental model relays the same, but the mental model relays the same is the prominent method of learning, okay? Because it's very convenient. Once established mental model is fixed, the next decision is very fast. Double loop learning, okay, it's what we call coherence theory, where the mental model and the decision change the actual model itself. So it's really important to understand the differences there. Down here in this diagram, we've got our mental representations. Now the 5 E's is just a mental representation. It's a teacher representation. And it's built from pre-propositional representations that come to us in natural like. I'm a teacher. I want to talk today about, for instance, evolution. What do my children know about bird beaks and how bird beaks are formed? So I'm to want to talk about adaptation. What are the mental models? Well, children basically will probably draw a bird with one kind of beak. Okay, so we can actually stretch that down. We can look at structural adaptations too, and we can show different types of beaks for different purposes. And of course, we can then start to build some mental imagery around that. So it's a process and a dynamic process, okay, where from non-iconic, it's pretty much straightforward understanding languages, through to iconic, so knowledge that's spread by images, spread by understandings, continuous, referential, and isomorphic programming of what we think we know. So what can we say about this? Single loop learning, double loop learning. The inquiry model is geared to drive students into double loop learning, but they won't go there on their own. What we want is to see coherence between their understanding and the science content they're learning. So much so that their understanding will shift in relation to the work they're doing. So just to explain why, the brain. So up here we've got your standard brain. This is the standard brain of a CQU student. And the common things that tick our fascinations. We've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, celebrities, takeaway foods, big in there. Oh, we've got a little function here for making commentaries, be it on FaceTime or whatever. We've got a football link here for the mails, big email function here, travel. We can see all of these main sections of the brain. Of course, that's not accurate. What we've really got here is an interaction between learning and memory. And just to explain to you how things happen, we've got 4 stages of learning. We acquire things, we collect them. We then rehearse them. We then retain it, and then we retrieve it. So that's learning. That goes into our memory. Acquisition, okay, we become aware of a stimulus. Okay, if it's immediate, it can be in seconds or minutes. If it goes into our immediate memory. Our working memory requires rehearsal, so we actually have to do something. Okay, and here we've got the focus on explicit teaching or explicit instruction. It can be from minutes to hours to get into your working memory. And long term, okay, is the retention, hours to a lifetime, something that you do over a long time. And we often hear this about people who are so crafted and so skilled, they've been doing something for a lifetime. It's in their long-term memory. So their learning has become well and truly embedded. And the categories of memory, semantic, okay, is the first category, words and meanings. Episodic, places and events. Procedural, we're often told how to do it, and here is where teaching comes into it. And contextual, the where and when, again, a big part of teaching. So we can see here the connections between literacy instruction, and investigations, semantic and episodic. Procedural, we can see here the pedagogy. So what we're building here is a model so that up on our right-hand side here, information coming from the world of science gets into the sensory memory and is acquired by the students through perhaps the first E, the engagement. It goes to the immediate memory, takes seconds to minutes, where it's rehearsed. Here we've got the explain and explore stage. It goes into the working memory where the student starts to build their own learning schema. Again, there's second rehearsal going on. There's double loop learning happening here. Once that's happened, of course, they then start to retain some of that information. Oh, okay, so I now do understand why certain birds have bent beaks and certain birds have straight beaks, certain birds have long beaks, and water birds have extremely long beaks. So I'm starting to retain some of this long-term memory. And of course, once it goes into your long-term memory, you can then retrieve it at any point in time to apply to your real-world models. So all of this, and I don't expect you to remember this, but just saying, you know, here is the brain science behind what we're talking about, you know, with inquiry-based learning. We have this little function in here, our little trash can called the amygdala, and it monitors our learning. So that all the time our working memory keeps bringing things back to the amygdala, and it admits or it denies access to that. And how it admits or denies is as we rehearse. The more we rehearse, okay, we have to engage with it. Once we engage with it, we rehearse, then we begin to retain. Once we retain, we can start to retrieve. Once we retrieve, we can start to apply. And this is how our brain works. This is why we have a model of inquiry-based learning. Now, that was an encyclopedia crammed into a very short period of time. Okay, so what we're meant to get from this week is not write an encyclopedia, but to grow our understanding of this inquiry curriculum and to grow our understanding of student learning so that when we present our Paishakusha, we can actually show what's going on at some of these learning stages. Okay, essentially what's happening in the 5 E's in a particular science unit at any given point in time. So there's our learning outcomes for the week. I'll just pause there. Any questions about that at this stage? I will record this. You can go back and have another listen to it. They're very simple models and instructional models of how information is processed. In reality, it's more complex than that. But essentially, we can see from the inquiry process that the 5 E's model creates an avenue for us to talk to our students. It gives us the framework. And from that framework, we can then interact with the students' understandings. And we can also, if a student doesn't get that understanding, we've got a point in our teaching model where we can come back to and we can revisit it. So some of the key terms this week were mental models. The way we think is bound up in language and our observations, and we just saw that from the diagram. Scientific literacy is made up of a range of things. Okay, skills, attitudes, procedures that we're being put through, okay, pedagogies that our teachers make us use, and the investigations, a variety of methods that can be used to answer a question, and creative thinking, predictions, planning and gathering evidence, and interpreting and reporting on evidence. So our learning focus in this particular pathway is quite strong. So the scientific method, in week 9, I'll introduce you to a woman called Catherine Metz. And some of you may know Catherine Metz. Has anyone read any of her work? No? Couple of shakes of heads there. I'm just tuning into some images. But Catherine Metz is brilliant, and she challenges Piaget's thinking, actually. Piaget wrote, he's a cognitive psychologist, obviously, from the 50s, 60s, and he talked about stage-based learning. Metz challenges that brilliantly and says that even children as young as early childhood and pre-early childhood years can actually use scientific methods. And we'll go through her theories quite a lot in weeks 9 and 10. But now, little theories is online. I'll just give you that as a link, really. You can Google Tim and Moby, The Mysteries of Life, and it's a great little cartoon involving Tim and Moby and a plant. And what it does, it basically models for early childhood children, very young early childhood children, the scientific method. So nobody is unable to use the scientific method as an inquiry-solving process. But if we go back to our previous diagram, it relies very much on how it's taught. Okay, you can't leave a student to learn it themselves. POE. Anyone ever used POE in their teaching? Can I just ask a question there? Right, we've got a lot of blank images at the moment. Anyone used POE before? Predict, observe, explain. Has anybody come across it in their primary connections unit that they're using for the assessment task? Has anyone ever done a placement in a Reef Guardian school? Right, drawing lots of blanks here. Okay, well, if you've been in a Reef Guardian school or are going to one, the Reef Guardian curricula done by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority uses the 5Es model, but it also has in there usually at least one or two activities geared towards predict, observe, explain, so POE. And it's based primarily on this notion that students are curious and you can show them a phenomenon and they can predict what's going to happen. They can then observe that phenomenon under investigative conditions and then they can try and explain the result. And it involves these scientific steps, as we can see: form a hypothesis, predict. Okay, here's a little example. My hypothesis for a project was that junior school, which is the younger years, have smaller carbon footprint, which means they produce less carbon when travelling to and from school. Interesting hypothesis. Again, from a young kid in a particular school. He observed through his process of investigation, there are about 3 times as many students were arriving by car than by bus, okay, from the younger age groups in junior school. Explanation: I found that this whole school produces, through his explanation and investigation techniques, 505 tonnes of carbon per year, and that 3 times more people went to school by car than by bus. Also, as age goes up, carbon emissions actually go down. So the fact that age goes up and carbon emissions goes down disproves my hypothesis. So we can see this child was actually in year 3 and he conducted this investigation. So, Metz is absolutely right. In the hands of a skilled teacher, the inquiry process really is a very, very safe way for students to develop their frameworks and to test and correct their own misconceptions. Now, I've got an example here from science investigations from, of course, the Science by Doing people. Now, we actually picked this up in week 9 in quite a bit more detail. We look at science investigations. Again, I'll point you at this stage for anyone who's looking for a unit to do their first assignment on. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park produce the Reef Guardian curricula. They're all done by 5Es, and they too would make fantastic units of study for this first assessment, the Peshakusha. And they're really, really good, and they come with their own investigation planners. But here's, this is the sort of tool that teachers are using with students. They're getting students to think about things that could infect their investigation. What are they actually going to measure and observe? And again, they're going to choose the variables. I will change, I will measure. I will not change, so that it is fair, and I will not measure. Now, we could apply this, for instance, to a car going down a ramp, okay? And we could see under what conditions the car went furthest. So we can sort of see a whole range of things that I will not change. There will be, for instance, I won't change the car. I won't change the angle of the ramp. Things I will change, for instance, will be perhaps how far up the ramp I place the car. All of these different things. So a fair test can be constructed. It has to be guided. And, if we are really going to set the learner free, we have to do it in a guided way. We have to teaching investigations and inquiry. But once we've taught the investigations and inquiry, as we move through our 5E model and we get to our upper stages, the 4th and 5th E, we are slowly setting the learner free. We are arming them with the tools. They are able to make a hypothesis. They know what a testable question is. They know what an independent variable is and a dependent variable. Okay, and of course they know how to collect data and design data collection tables. So these are the steps that ultimately your units will be giving to the teacher to give to the student, to apprentice that student into that scientific inquiry. And we can see the links here. Things to measure and observe. Variables. I will not change, I will change, I will not measure. Things I will measure. So the student is extremely clear. Getting your testable question right by making hypothesis and identifying your independent and dependent variables, even your controlled variables, things that you'll keep the same. Knowing what your procedure is and ultimately turning all of this into a data capture and collection tool. So sample data capture, here we go, a really simple table. And data can be captured in a whole range of ways. It can be done, you know, why use a table? Why not just use a piece of string? If you're measuring cars, just cut the string, lay it alongside and say, you know, trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, and then you can measure your pieces of string later on. So teachers can be quite adaptable. Toilet paper, I've also seen used out on an oval as a really, really good way of capturing data. So, you know, one toilet roll sort of gets stretched over 100 metres, represented, you know, so many million miles, light years travel to the sun. So you can do a whole range of things with data capture. Okay, it's a really interesting way to, you know, to explore students' knowledge, from graphing results, charting variables, graphing results, repeating the test trials 1, 2, and 3 to ensure that it's fair, okay, and having a look at what the change response were. Investigations. We're talking here about teaching and thinking scientifically. A couple of things. I'm just throwing in this particular website tonight. There's a couple of people, I'll see if I can bring it over for you. Oh. Here's the actual website live. It's a brilliant story, this one, and we talk about teaching science. And this one is called The Story Behind the Science. And what it does, it breaks the science down into a whole range of different strands or substrands. And for instance, we can go in here into biology, and we can have a look at some, for instance, some information on Charles Darwin, who he was, a gentle revolutionary, and he was a very gentle man. And it tells the story behind Charles Darwin. And these are often really, really good backdrops to science, because sometimes when we're trying to teach science, it can appear a little bit disembodied. It can appear a little bit distant and disconnected from people. And one thing we really want to do is bring in that human factor, you know, the human strand, the human endeavour focus. And we can see here that, you know, this is a wonderful website. It features so many scientists, and it brings in, you know, very, very strongly the human endeavour aspect of, you know, many of our great scientific discoveries and events. So just to remind you of that one, there is the URL there, storybehindthescience.org. It's a very, very good site. Very, very good resources, and it will just strengthen your teaching of science and science concepts. Now I'm going to move on to the assessment criteria for assessment task number 1. Can I begin by opening the floor, please, and asking if anyone's got a particular question they'd like me to address, so that I can actually respond more to what you need rather than what I think you might need. All right, Maxine, do you have any questions about the assessment criteria? Are you clear on what you need to do for this assessment task?
I kind of think so. I'm still like kind of researching, and yeah, I'm like half there. I do and I don't get it. I think I get it, but I just need to do a little bit more reading and stuff. I have picked my my unit, but I'm just trying to get the questions that go and what I think I would like to use and trying to work it out. So I'm still kind of like on that process of trying to get it for myself, understand it, but I am like half nearly there, but I'm not there yet.
Thanks, Maxine. That's a really honest answer. I really appreciate that answer. That's great. Who else is at the stage Maxine's at? It's okay to be at that stage, where you're toying around with which one best suits you. Okay, it's probably around that time that you need to be making that decision. Let's have a look at the criteria. Now, your Paishakusha is 20 by 20. So it's 20 slides at 20 seconds. I should really correct that right now and say it's 20 by 17. Okay, I really want to say that, because by the time you try to save your slide in PowerPoint, there is a slide transition period. And the last thing you want to do to your marker is have something really, really important to say and for the slide to be transitioning and your marker not to hear it. So if you can, focus on speaking in about 17 seconds and give your slide a nice gentle pause to click into its next slide, so you're not losing any words and any impact. I do encourage that, and that doesn't mean talking faster. Okay, it actually means editing your content so that you're speaking for about 17 seconds. And you can also refer to the next slide coming. You can refer to the previous slide. It's a narrative. So even though one slide may be really tight at 17 or 18 seconds, the next slide, you might have a little bit of think time and wait time where you can actually refer to the previous slide. It spoke about this, or we covered this, or we saw this. Okay, in this particular slide, we can see how this is developed and extended. So use it as a dynamic interaction. Okay, criteria 1 talks about the explanation of a chosen issue in science education and pedagogy from the topic sheet. Now, there are 10 topics, so you're all limited. So that's roughly about 18 to 20 people per topic completing that topic. Please jump on the forum and talk about it. It's not a crime to do that. We are not in competition. We're talking here about being the best teachers that we can possibly be. In a teaching framework, you would be talking to your colleagues all the time about what you're doing. You'd be swapping units. You'd be sharing ideas. So jump on the forum, take control, and do that sharing. You can see explanation of a chosen issue in science education and pedagogy from the listed topic sheet. So you've got to choose your topic and you've got to explain it. Okay? So often in the past, I've seen students simply flash a topic up on their first slide. Here's a great chance to talk about why this topic is of interest and why it's of interest to you and why it's relevant. Okay? So it's a really good chance to do that. Some at the higher end, we can see elaborate explanation of your chosen issue is well presented. So obviously, as we go through the criteria, you're going to have to explain your chosen issue well. So if your issue is engagement, what is engagement exactly? Okay, because in the 5 E's, we could think it's the first step, but actually it's not. In the 5 E's model, engagement pretty quickly morphs into motivation. And motivation is embedded in pedagogical knowledge and applications. So we're starting to see at each of the stages of the 5 E's, engagement shifts from being an actual physical meeting place with the students where you diagnose their needs. Then it shifts into motivating them to push through each of the remaining stages of learning. Okay, so think about this criteria as you're doing it. Think about as you're doing the assessment. Am I doing an elaborate explanation of this issue? And have I covered what engagement is? Have I looked at it, from inside as well? Have I done a full 360 analysis, for instance, of Indigenous perspectives? Why? Okay, what is the big push for it? It's a priority. Why is it a priority? Okay, because it's a complementary way of seeing the world. Very complementary, because we have a high Indigenous population in Queensland. What's the benefit of that? Okay, because it's engaging. It's a great way to link culture and identity with science in a way that embeds it in students' frameworks that makes their learning authentic and real. So we can explore all of these things. Ask yourself, have I been elaborate or have I simply been comprehensive? Okay, which is slightly different. Elaborate is whereas you're making connections. Comprehensive is where you're being thorough. Elaborate, of course, extend. Comprehension is where you're demonstrating your understanding. Substantial explanation, again, is probably not as strong as comprehensive explanation. And some explanation drops off again, and superficial explanation, of course, you get the idea. There are gaps here in substantial application, okay? But your topic is well defined and your explanation is comprehensive. But here, of course, you can see the topic is totally unpacked throughout your Peshakusha. Curriculum and pedagogical connections explicitly justified and fully explained. So this is a very fat, P-H-A-T, a very fat, a very rich, a very alive presentation of your Peshakusha. This is a strong presentation. It's well defined. Curriculum connections are made. The contexts are justified. So you're a strong performance here. Substantial here is a competent one. You know what you're doing. Some explanation, you're getting half of it. You're able to use half of it. You're able to activate half of this information in a way that's going to enable your unit to be effective for learners. And superficial, of course, you're struggling. Okay, so the criteria are designed to split performance. And sometimes they're stretching a little bit to differentiate between both. But if you have a look at some of the examples, for instance, that we've put online, and again, they're written for different criteria, but you can see that some of them do some of these things very, very well, and others do them less well. So criterion 2, explicit identification, connections to key concepts in an identifiable unit. So you've got to identify your unit. Okay, you've got to connect the 5 E's to your topic. And you can't just focus on one of the E's or two of these, three. You've got to follow the full module. You've got to explain how the 5 E's, what it looks like at each stage of the unit, and what the teacher's doing and what the student's doing. Okay, so the integrated pedagogies. And by doing that, you're showing your understanding. Okay, that's what you're doing. You've demonstrated your studentness. And that's what we're here to see. As a student of this course, am I getting this inquiry process? Do I know how to dissect a unit? Am I able to take the anatomy of that unit and link it to one of 10 topics and explore how that topic scaffolds, how that topic stretches out right across that unit? Okay, and can I do it in insightful ways where I'm connecting the curriculum and the pedagogy at each stage to the learner's outcomes? Okay, if not as insightful, am I making appropriate connections? Okay, am I at the least relevant? Or am I making some connections? Or am I actually making no connections? Is this beyond me? Am I not getting it? Criteria number 3, knowledge and understanding of the concept development and teaching strategies of the science curriculum. So again, this is a little bit connected to the one above. Okay, and they're all a little bit connected. So if you're doing number 1 and 2 strongly, chances are you're doing this one very strongly as well. Because, by looking at the curriculum in the way you're doing it and having explicit identification and doing a comprehensive analysis of it, you are demonstrating deep knowledge and understandings of concept development. So you're showing what you know about science, okay, and about science concepts and about curriculum concepts. Again, down at the other end, you're unable to do that for some reason. Now, if you're struggling with any of these criteria, if you're not sure what they mean, now is the time to start jumping on the forum and asking this. Okay, so chances are if you're doing criterion 1 and 2 at a high level, this one would also naturally follow. You demonstrated deep knowledge and understanding because you're doing this one and this one quite well. Okay, coherent and informed. That's a pretty good outcome as well. Okay, right down to here, for instance, substantial knowledge and understanding. So you may know a lot about science, but perhaps, you're not making the relevant connections. You're not, utilising the pedagogy. You're not bringing them to life. Criterion 4, demonstrated understanding of the curriculum priorities of the ACS, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Australia in Asia, and sustainability. You do not have to do all 3. Okay, you name which 1 or 2 you're going to do. And then the evidence that you present in your Paishakusha will determine your result on this criteria. So if, for instance, you're going to talk primarily about integrating Indigenous perspectives, okay, then that's all the marker will look for. If you want to talk about sustainability as your topic, as your cross-curriculum priority, that is all the marker will look for. You do not have to do all 3. This is to give you flexibility because some of the topics lend themselves very well to Indigenous perspectives and some of them lend themselves very well to sustainability perspectives. But Asia in Australia or Australia in Asia is a cross-curriculum perspective that really doesn't have a lot of input, a lot of emphasis in the primary school units. Okay, it really doesn't kick in until year 7 and 8. So I would expect that very few of you will actually do the Australia in Asia perspective, but some of you may decide to do one, the Indigenous, or both, and sustainability. So what, for instance, could engagement look like from an Indigenous perspective and also from a sustainability perspective? Or you may limit yourself just to one, but the criteria will apply to how well you do that one. Do you have a sophisticated and accurate understanding of Indigenous perspectives or of sustainability perspectives? Okay, and are they presented and do they shine through your Paishakusha? Is there a high level of understanding? Is it substantial? So we get the key terms already. We know the hierarchy, but the key thing here is I get a few questions about this criteria. You do not need to do all 3. Now I'll just flick onto the final one and talk about it before I open the floor to any questions. Criteria 5 is worth 6 marks, and it's a clear and concise Paishakusha 20 by 20 presentation using authoritative sources to justify and explain approaches to science teaching that promote learning and enjoyment. So remember, here's the whole focus. Okay, you've got a Paishakusha convention to observe. It's a genre. It's a style. But it must also, it's a visual style. Again, you won't have a lot of text in your Paishakusha. All of your text will be oral. You'll be spoken primarily, and there will be keywords and concepts flashed up on your screens. It will be predominantly imagery mixed with important text. So it's a really clear and strong and obvious genre. Okay, and it's based, the success of the images and of the text and of your spoken word very much depends on how you source, the authoritative sources that you draw your discussions from. So when you're talking about your particular chosen topic, don't just limit yourself to what's said in Gregson. Okay, Gregson is a textbook. It's not an authoritative source. You may need to go broader and actually do some deeper reading on your topic. So again, a couple of authoritative sources that you can draw upon, will go a long way towards keeping you in the upper end of this particular curriculum criterion. So presentation is produced to a sophisticated level using the conventions, but used only some relevant and credible sources. So you can see if you're up here, you're doing a good Paishakusha, great imagery, great injection of text, nice sequence and flow, the words, the oral components coming through strongly, it's well-resourced and credible, and chances are you're getting a 6 out of 6. Okay, if it's sophisticated, but only some relevant and credible sources, so in other words, if you're starting to rely a little bit too much on Gregson, okay, then chances are that there's a little bit of intellectual laziness there. You haven't done some of the reading that you could have done, okay, and the chances are that you could substantiate your point of view much more than you have. So you're probably looking at a 5, okay, a high level, okay, and again, use a wide range of resources, okay, only some of which contribute directly to the integrity of the work. So in other words, you're referencing here, you're citing, but a lot of it's missing the mark. Okay, but you've got all the behaviours right. You've got the Paishakusha format done. You're observing the conventions, but it's just not as powerful as the Paishakusha that actually uses extensive and relevant and credible sources, and so on down the scale. I'm going to stop there and ask you for any comments or questions.
Colin, hi, it's Sarah Rodwell.
How are you, Sarah?
Good, thank you. So my thing was to do the butterflies, the biological thing for, I think, grade 2. So if I, like I said in my email, the kids at that stage were looking at mealworms. So if I deviate to butterflies, am I talking about the whole science unit or just butterflies?
Well, you're dealing with a unit at the moment, and your task at this stage, Sarah, is to demonstrate your knowledge of that particular unit and how it's bringing to life the 5Es model. Okay, how it's bringing to life inquiry learning, and that involves both content, science content, as well as pedagogy. So you'll be exploring how that unit on mealworms is doing that. You then will open up the option, when you get to levels 4 and 5, you could demonstrate some of the techniques, and deviate from the unit at that particular point in time. What does your unit do, for instance, for the elaboration stage? I don't have it in front of me, so I can't look at it. But
sorry. I did have it, so. Right. Oh. So biological sciences. Sorry.
it's quite all right. Everyone else is thinking of their questions.
Yes, sorry. Where would I find the elaborations? Oh, sorry, found them. Okay. So biological sciences, living things grow, change, and have offspring similar to themselves. And then elaborations are representing personal growth and changes from birth, recognizing that living things have predictable characteristics at different stages of development, exploring different characteristics of life stages in animals such as egg, caterpillar, and butterfly.
Fabulous.
and observing that animals have offspring, usually with two parents.
Okay, now in your unit with the mealworms, what happens at the elaboration stage there, at stage 4? You may not have it in front of you, but I'm just thinking from my perspective that is when, for instance, you will have worked through the students, you will have done the first 3 E's, and you will have worked right through to the explain and explore using mealworms, and that seems to be a good point where you could then start to take their learning and you could then start to open it up by way of investigation and also introduce the science inquiry skills. And that would be a great time to, for instance, expose them to caterpillars, butterflies and eggs, which could be slightly different to the mealworm model that they've been looking at, so you can actually test the coherence of their learning and design an alternate or a similar summative assessment piece around that. So definitely for the Paishakusha, you are going to have to follow the unit because the marks are given for demonstrating your knowledge and understanding of the science and the pedagogy in that unit. But you will also reach a stage when you get to the last 2 E's where you can then start to open up the learning for students, make it more negotiated, and again, more of an open inquiry process than a closed inquiry process. And that's where butterflies, would fit in nicely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That does. Yeah.
Fabulous. Any other questions about this criteria, about the assignment in general?
Yeah, hi, I do. There was a question that came up in the chat box earlier that I have the same question, and that is, are we required to submit like a typed up version of the oral voiceover that we are putting over our PowerPoint?
Look, I think you're not required to submit it because I've found in the past that the Moodle sometimes will only accept one document. But I do encourage you to have it on hand just in case something goes wrong. Okay, now often we find, for instance, that when people go to submit at the last minute, and invariably people do tend to run the gauntlet with the Paishakusha, which I wouldn't advise. Give yourself at least a day to get it uploaded because it can be a sizable document. And once it's uploaded, obviously it's fine. But I think about 5 students last year I had to actually email because their file attachment had corrupted, or they'd actually saved it in a borrowed computer using a different file format, and it couldn't be opened by their marker. So we then had to call on them to provide just screenshots of their presentation and a script of their text. So it is good if you've got a script, absolutely, but you are not required to submit it. It will be called upon by a marker if there's a problem with the file that you do submit. Is that clear enough?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Good question. Any other questions? Now, I'm realising it's early days. A lot of you are just starting to get serious about looking at the presentation at the moment. That's great. No judgment there whatsoever. You've got busy lives, and I fully understand that biological earth and space sciences is not your #1 priority. It breaks my heart, but I understand that. There's at least 4 or 5 other competing things in front of it. So, I do understand that. Please make contact. Ask questions, particularly if you're thinking about pulling out of the subject before the 27th. Give me a call, have a chat, because often a third set of eyes can help. Start using the forums. I mean, tonight we've gone through a lot of theory about brain connections to inquiry. And again, these are all to stimulate your thinking about the Paishakusha. What would learning look like at this stage? What would teaching look like? What pedagogies is the teacher using? What assessment's going on here? Diagnostic at the engage stage. Okay, at the explain and explore stage, we're doing formative. And then, of course, we're shifting towards, inquiry skills in stage 4 and ultimately heading towards summative assessment in stage 5 in the 5th E of evaluation. So what's going on in your unit at each of those stages? And the Paishakusha is your 20 by 20 pictorial of what you think is going on there for teachers and learners and how it connects to theory. Okay, that's what we're doing here with this assignment. Now I'll just pause briefly for another minute or two and see if anyone's got another question from left field they might like. And failing that, I'll put this towards record and get it posted for tonight. So any questions? All questions welcome. Any comments? All comments welcome too. Is there something somebody would like more of?
Colin?
Yes, Loretta.
Sorry, I've come into this unit very late. Anyway, I've had other constraints, so I've come in a bit late. I've been trying to catch up on all the course material.
Welcome. Yep.
Look, I love the science element in that, but I must say, after reading, I think the first 2 weeks of the content, I think my brain was thinking I was learning about science. And for me, the first week was more about backgrounds, and there was a whole lot of literature in there that I found very interesting. Coming now to the point of putting together this pitch to this 20 by 20, just my understanding, it's 20 slides at 17 seconds a slide. Is that right?
At theoretically, they're at 20 seconds a slide, but technology being imperfect, I would time myself at around 17 to allow the transitions. That way your message gets across. Yeah.
Okay, so I basically build a PowerPoint, and then I have my elaboration. I speak as presenting that PowerPoint.
That's correct.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
You can storyboard it completely, and then you can script each slide, and then it's just a matter of rehearsing each slide in a comfortable way until you've got it down to your 17 seconds that you're comfortable with. And then you get the balance between image and text on your slide. You get that to a level that you're comfortable with. And of course,
yes,
you throw in there a smattering of theory on your important concepts. Like if I'm talking about engagement, what is engagement? Let me throw in some perspectives on what engagement is. Who says what? So you're demonstrating in this presentation, you're demonstrating your studentness. You're saying, look, I'm a student. I'm here. I've arrived. I'm splashing it out over 20 slides now. Have a look. Yeah.
Okay. If, for example, I take on 10, communicating science through narrative techniques, I could use examples from narratives and storybooks.
Absolutely. And obviously
there's some excellent ones where I could bring in, for argument's sake, gravity or cyclones, or, if I bring in indigenous perspectives,
yeah, beautiful, Loretta. Yeah.
Things like that. So
even oral
am I
culture.
in the right direction?
Yes, you are. Even oral culture is a big part of that, yes.
Yeah, okay. Just so that I'm not floundering, that if I had to bring in, for argument's sake, I'd scan in excerpts from the narrative, would that work? And then I'd use those as the basis of how I'm engaging the children.
Absolutely. Beautiful.
Okay.
Yep. And of course you would narrate that in your spoken component of your Paishakusha.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
I'm happy with that.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Loretta.
Colin.
Well, very good questions. Thank you. Are there any...
Colin, I have another question. So if you are over with your word, if you're over the 17 minutes, will you actually get really bad penalised?
Oh, look, I mean, theoretically it's criteria, isn't it? 20 by 20 is the format. You may get marked down, for instance, on the final criteria. If you're going to drive your Paishakusha so hard that it no longer looks, smells and feels like a Paishakusha, like it's 20 by 27 or something, then chances are people are going to say that's unfair advantage. And that's where a decision needs to be made by the course coordinator, who is myself. I'd have to sit down with a marker and they sort of say, look, 5 of these slides go over 27 seconds. And I'd still say, okay, well, that does constitute a little bit of unfair advantage, because that means this student actually has 35 seconds more to explain their point of view than every other student. So that really is a little bit unfair. So if you can, try to keep it to 20 by 20. But if you're going 1 or 2 seconds over, chances are, you do need to set your timer on the slide. So obviously it'd probably cut you off, and then you'll have to go back and do your re-editing yourself to get within 20 seconds anyway.
Okay, so try to not go over.
Try to not go over, yes. But look, no one's been taken out, drawn and flogged for going over 20 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
the key test we have, Maxine, is one of relevance. If you've gone 22 seconds and it was relevant, and that's the way it was, fantastic. If you've gone 20 seconds and all of a sudden the machine cuts you off and we miss the last bit, then that's a fail. You know, that not an assignment fail, but that's a oh gee, what happened? I had 20 seconds of really good information there, and I'm missing the last 2 seconds because the students set the automatic timing at 20, and the transitions cut it off. So be in control of it. That's what I'm saying. Rehearse. Try to keep it to 20. If it's relevant and you go to slightly over 20 and it doesn't get cut off, no problems usually. Okay, but try not to make too much of a habit of it, because that's when that fair advantage decision would cut in. Yeah, so don't put yourself at risk.
Okay, thank you.
Very good question. Any others?
Hi, Colin. It's Rosalind here. How are you?
Very well, Rosalind. How are you?
Good. I have a question on the opposite end. If we feel that our picture and the text that we have on that particular slide doesn't require a lot of voiceover or limited, do we have to do the 17 seconds?
No, you're in total control. And this is something that comes into teaching, isn't it, Rosalind? This whole notion of wait time. We know that wait time actually adds incredibly. It's one of the most significant moderators of learning. The more and the more effectively you use wait time in your teaching, the better you get your message across, believe it or not, as a teacher. So if you have a slide where you're going to say something impactful for 5 seconds and then have background music for people to contemplate what you just said, then wow, if that fits your story and if that adds impact and value to your message, then that can be a really sexy and exciting thing to do. Takes a lot of confidence though. Most of us in that situation try to say more, the temptation. But often if your presentation's going really, really well, less is more. I get where you're coming from.
Okay, thank you.
Colin, sorry, one more question.
No problems, Loretta.
What technology are we going to be submitting?
It is a PowerPoint, as in a PPTX format.
Yes.
It's saved.
Okay.
And
with a voiceover?
With a voiceover, yes.
Okay. No problem. Thank you.
You're welcome. And there are some information related to that on the website itself. And I'll talk more about that. I'll bring that into the discussion next week, because obviously it's going to come onto your radar more and more the closer we get. If there's no more questions, I will put this to record and save. I thank you all for your attendance and time. Please, let's let the questions keep coming and firing. I know there's lots of them. I'm getting a sense there's more and more as we go through. And let's get them out there and share them around. And as I said before, this is not a competition. We're in competition for kids. We want the best possible outcomes for them. We want to be the best scientists, teachers we can be. And we also want to support each other to get the best results we can from this course and this unit. So, let's not think we're in competition. Let's get out there and share ideas and bounce them off each other, because there's some very good ideas coming off this floor. Thank you all very much. And I wish you good night. And please don't hesitate to make contact.